And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 257. Today, black and white. More specifically, high contrast black and white. And maybe even more specifically, or at least alongside, why you should never actually take your photos in black and white. Lots of fun to have. Right, so if you're looking to improve your understanding of photography, then you're in the right place. Stick around, leave a comment to let me know you're here if you happen to be watching live. Leave a comment down below, tell me what the weather's doing, all the usual kind of stuff, and we can make a start. Wrong one. Let's try this. Yes, as you can see, 257 episodes in, and I still get messed up by the technicals. Never mind. So yes, if you happen to be watching live, you can tell that this is live, then yes, leave a comment. Let me know where you are, let me know what the weather's doing, ask me questions, do all the usual bits and pieces. If you don't happen to be watching live, you can still leave a comment though. In fact, I think it even helps the YouTube algorithms if you leave comments down in the usual comment space as well. So yeah, ask questions, give me your opinions, your thoughts, your input, all these kind of things. They're always welcome. I can see we have got a few people in already. So April says, greetings from a beautiful, sunny Long Island, New York. Robert says, howdy all from a sunny and mild North Texas. Janet says, hi from a warm, sunny Mississauga. And Nadia says, hi from a dull, overcast day in Fife. And here in Castle Douglas in southwest Scotland, it is cold, damp, miserable. Yeah, I mean, it just really feels like autumn has come, but not that nice crisp autumn, that just cold where you just want to kind of wrap up, where you're really thinking, I know it's only the middle of September, but we've got to stick the heating back on. It's damp. It's not raining heavy. I mean, not like over the weekend, but it's just, yeah, cold, damp. It's in the bones cold. It's not a dry cold, it's a damp cold, and it's just not overly pleasant. However, so I'm going to sort of spend the entire podcast not understanding photography, but just moaning about Castle Douglas weather. That wouldn't be quite so good. Right, so, let's do a quick update on the Smug Points, and then we'll launch into today's topic. So, yeah, Smug Points so far for September, because we've only had one Sunday previously, and the Smug... both Nadia and Inga put in images for feedback and critique, so you can go back and double check episode 256 if you want to see the feedback they got on their photos. They both got 25 Smug Points, plus they both turned up and left comments live, so that gave them an extra 5 Smug Points, so they're both sitting neck and neck on 30 Smug Points each. Everybody else is either on 5 Smug Points because they left a comment live, or 0 Smug Points because they weren't here and didn't leave a comment. So still plenty to play for. We've got this one. There's not going to be a podcast next week, and then there will be one the following week. Stick around. I'll talk about all what's coming up for the rest of the month at the end of the podcast. But meanwhile, remember to hit like, subscribe, all the usual bits and pieces. Now, where are we? Okay, so let's make a little start here. So what we're going to talk about today is the notion of black and white. Oh, and just before we get to that, VG says, good evening, everyone. Glad you could make it, VG. So today we're talking about the notion of black and white, and more specifically high contrast black and white photos. And then what I'm going to also weave into this is really a kind of understanding why you shouldn't take your photos in black and white. And what I mean by that is not that you don't take photos to appear black and white, but that you don't use the default black and white setting on your camera. Plenty of cameras, whether it's your phone, your DSLR, your bridge camera, your mirrorless, all these kind of things, will have a little black and white option. But if you do that, it tends to be very limiting, and you're going to get to understand why if you don't already before the end of this podcast is out. But part of that is about the notion of how we convert to black and white. So this podcast is kind of split into two. Because it's about high contrast black and white, first of all, you need to understand black and white. And there are multiple ways of converting your image to black and white. So first part of this podcast is going to be about the different ways you can convert to black and white, and in essence the strengths and weaknesses of each. Then the second part will be kind of taking this notion of black and white and then going for this notion of high contrast, okay, where you've got much more in the way of darks and lights and much less in the way of tonal range as such. So that's really what we're going to be talking about today. So as we go, leave comments, leave questions, give me feedback, keep the chat going, and it always makes the podcast feel a bit more lively when there's a chat going on. A couple more people have joined us. Meg says hello everyone, and John says hello from Columbus, Ohio. Welcome Meg and John. Right, okay, so let's talk then about this notion of black and white. As I say, most cameras tend to have a little black and white option on them. But the problem is when you use that, unless you also have a raw file which will keep the colour, the black and white, the camera's black and white will make the decision for you on what happens when it turns black and white. And actually there's a whole bunch of different ways you can do it, which are going to deeply affect the way the picture looks in black and white. So the best way to do this, I think, is to start off with a photo and show you what I mean. So let's say we start with something like this. So picture of a purple tulip, and in the background, slightly out of, well, not slightly, but very out of focus, is a red and yellow tulip as well. So this was taken in the kitchen window. There's a little bit of backlight coming through the window. We've got this lovely kind of, and it's sort of creating this little translucent effect through the purple here. Now, what I want to do here is show you what we will do is let's just open this in Photoshop and show you what happens. So here we have our photo, and that's great, nice and colour. But supposing we want to have a black and white version of this. Now, the most obvious thing to do is to just desaturate, literally take the colours out. So desaturate, so if I go to the options here, scroll down to hue saturation, take the saturation slider, I can boost the saturation, make it like really garish and awful, or I can take that slider and drag it down. And that gives us a black and white, okay? So that's essentially our easy, simple version of black and white. By and large, though, it's a fairly limited version. It's not bad, it's okay, but there are other things we could do as well. I'll tell you what, let's show you another photo as well. If I say take this photo. So here's a really colourful photo where, so this was a shoot I did, oh God, about 10 years ago I think it was. But anyway, I did this shoot for a friend of mine, Morag, who creates these really colourful kimonos. Our model Laminish here, sitting on this bed in amongst all these colourful cushions. There's lights. We've got I've got a blue gel on a off-camera flash over on the left here. I've got a red gel over on, so just shrink that down a bit so you can see the red over on the right there. And so it's just absolutely full of colour. And again, if I open that in Photoshop, just fill that screen a little bit more, take the hue saturation and drag it down, we end up with a black and white photo. And again, it's okay. Obviously, we've lost all that richness of colour. But what I really notice about this is the fact that there's not all of the kind of the tonal range is all kind of pushed into the middle. You don't get very much in the way of black blacks or white whites. There might be a bit of a white strip in this. Similarly, when we look at this one, everything's kind of in the middle. And if I shove a levels on there, what we can see, if we look at the histogram, is everything is bunched up in the middle. Okay, there's a big gap over on the right here, which actually, where the whites are, and there's a big gap on the left where the darks are, right? So it's kind of pushed everything into the middle. And again, if I go to here and I grab the levels, we can see the histogram is all sitting in the middle again. Again, there's more light that could be had. There's maybe a little bit more dark. There's contrast. It's not doing very much in the way of contrast. It's taking the colour out, but it's not really giving us much in the way of a range. Now, part of this is to do with the way when we take photos in colour, we're not too worried about really broad tonal range, or we're not really worried generally speaking, about the blacks needing to be black and the whites needing to be white. Because what we're dealing with, if we go back to here, when we look at a colour picture, everything is about the colour, okay? What makes this picture is that bright purple and then offset against that yellow and red in the background. Oh, I see Inga's joined us from Oslo. Welcome, Inga. And April says pretty shot. So when we're looking in a colour photo, the colour is a really important part, is the most important part of it, is whether the colours and the colour relationships are going to be what makes or breaks a photo like this. Similarly, when we're looking at our kimono shot and the colours of the richness of the bed and the cushions and the curtains and drapes and everything else, then it's the colour that is in it's the contrast of the colour, the reds against the yellows against the blues, which are making the picture. But when we suck the colour out, we end up with this histogram here where everything's just kind of in the middle, everything's just a little bit dull. So if you just literally desaturate your colours, it doesn't really tend to give them necessarily the best effect. And very often, if you go back to this notion of using your camera and putting on black and white setting, that's what it does. It just desaturates the colour. Now, black and white, once you remove the colour, tends to be much more about tonal range. Because you're not distinguishing one part of the photo from another by the colours and the colour relationships, you are distinguishing them by the tonal relationships, by the darks against the lights, okay? How they contrast, how they complement. So if we go back to our tulip here, and so hue saturation then is one way of creating that black and white. Now, so let's move on to a second way of doing black and white, which is a really clear one, which is gradient map. So if I look over here, we've got hue saturation. Further down, I've got gradient map. Now, let's talk a little bit about what gradient map is. If we look over on my toolbar on the left here, I've got a front colour and a back colour. I've got two here, which I've currently got set to black and white. But let's say I set that to red and white, okay? Oh, actually, sorry, I should have done that on this one here. Get the right level here. So I'm going to set that to red and white. Now, what the gradient map is going to do is it's going to take the front colour as the equivalent of a black and the back colour as the equivalent of a white, which in this case it still is, and it's going to make it a single tone. It's going to just move between the two colours. So when I go gradient map, we can see we've got the blacks have become red. Now, if I decided to change that to, I could change this to any colour I like actually. I could take this and I could do a colour picker okay, cancel that for a moment. Quicker way of doing this is, let's say over here I decided to make that this kind of yellow. Then I could do a gradient map which would take me from reds to yellows, okay? And you end up with this kind of colour. Now, also with a gradient map, you have an option of adding in extra colours. I could even stick something in here, and you can have multiple colours. You see, you can pick and choose other little variations. But for the most part, what we tend to be talking about is it's moving from one to the other. So if I go back to here, and I set the front colour to black, and I set the back colour to white, then what happens is it's now going to give us a tonal range where it's going to go specifically from black all the way through to white. So now, if I go to my gradient map, hit here, we can see we've got this. Now, let me just clear out these other two here, just to avoid confusion. Now, if we compare that to the hue saturation, that was just getting rid of the saturation. The gradient map is making it darker, the dark's darker and the light's lighter. So it's kind of adding a bit of a punch. Now within that gradient map, there's a couple of different versions. If you've got a much earlier version of Photoshop, then it just tends to have the one, but later versions tend to have a variation. Now this one says smooth, but we've got 5 here, although to be honest, stripes doesn't seem to do anything. Never figured that one out. But there's perceptual, linear, classic, smooth, and stripes. Now, this is defaulted to smooth, but you can see classic, this is what it used to, gradient map standardly did. Linear, which is going much more for a kind of high key version, and perceptual. So they're all slightly different, but what they're doing is they're adding more punch to it. Okay, so that's on classic. Let's show you what happens then with this shot here. So if I, instead of the hue saturation, I go to gradient map with the black and white, and again, by comparison, it's added punch. Okay, it's made the blacks blacker, it's made the whites whiter, and it's created a kind of a bigger range between. So now if I go to my levels, and we look at this levels here, we can see that now it's actually sort of dropped it off. It's more kind of gone for the deeper blacks. Whereas if I go for the gradient map and put it on linear, if we then look at the levels, you can see the histogram moved over to the right. Okay, and we've lost the blacks. But I could take this and I could drag this down. If I want to have it as a brighter image, I might decide to start with the linear and play around with the levels a little bit like that. So the point is that there are other options which tend to be, generally speaking, slightly more interesting than just pure desaturating. It gives it more punch if you go for the gradient map. Okay. Oh, Marilyn's joined us as well. Says hello from Colorado. Glad you could make it along, Marilyn. So what we're seeing then is that you can go for straightforward desaturation, but if you use gradient map, that's sometimes giving you extra options. Now, there's a third way you can play around with converting to black and white. Now, some of you may remember me doing this before, and it's quite a fun thing to do. I'm going to remove those, come back to our original one here, and that is the use of channels. Okay, so in an RGB picture, red, green, blue, you have, it's made up of the three different light colours. So our screens on that we're looking at on our phones, on our tablets, on our computers, have three different lights: red, green and blue. And then the mix of those, when you mix all of them together, you get white. When you remove them all, you get black. And then how they're mixed up creates the different range of colours that we've got. And what the channels bit here does is it splits them. So if I click over on channels, you can see here we've got the full colour at the top, then we've got red, green and blue. Now if I select only the red, what it does with the reds is it's like, imagine the idea of having a red filter on it. If anybody remembers like the old analog days, when if you had a colour, you might have colour film, you put a red filter on, and what it does is it filters out the red light. So the red light then isn't hitting the sensor, isn't hitting the negative or whatever, and so doesn't really register. So anything that red becomes kind of white. Whereas the opposite end, the green or blue end of that, would register to be black. So if you've got a red filter here, what happens is the reds in our picture, which are, we can see, very much contained, there we go. So the red in the back here has become very, very pale, and the reddishness in the purple of the tulip has become paler. If I go to the green, now what happens is the leaves have got lighter slightly, or rather, and the red here has become darker. And if I go to the blue, now the blue, especially where the light was coming through the tulip, is now kind of become highlighted, and the red and the greens have become darker as well. So what we can see here is that the red channel, green channel, blue channel are all giving us very, very different sense of black and white. Okay, so you can start here. So instead of just doing a sort of straightforward hue saturation, or even a gradient map, you've got other options to play with just going into your channels. So what I might do is I might pick this blue channel because I rather like the pale bit up there. I will just select all, copy, got all this back, go back into layers, put paste. Now, just drag that up there and put it out for a moment. Now if I go back to the gradient map, what I could do with this is mask that and then paint, take my thing and let's say I do a little 50% here and just sort of paint some of that extra one into there, something like that. And just so I can sort of, maybe darken down that leaf or lighten up that bit, or I can start layering. I'm using the mask to play around with different versions of the channels and black and white and mixes. So I hope that's all kind of making sense. So look, where it really, if you really want to see channels at work even more so, you take a picture like this, where it is so full of colour. Now, if I go to the channels on this one, if we look at the red here, everything becomes really much paler because the full colour is full of in that kind of red yellow. There's a lot of red yellows in here, okay? And where the red, I've got the red gel on the light over here, we can see it becomes practically white, okay? Now if I go to the green, you see it changes. It's quite different. And then if I go to the blue, it shifts again, okay? And over here, then the blue light has has lit up, and the red has dropped down. You wouldn't have known that there was a red light on that one. In the green, it's somewhere in between in the red. But again, if we look at something like the patterns on the kimono, look at how much they change depending on whether the red, the green, or the blue is lighter or darker compared to the colours around. It also becomes really noticeable on the skin tones. And if you look at the skin tones, say, compared to the lipstick, here we've got, the kind of yellowish brown skins with the red lipstick. Here, everything's pale. Here, there's a really strong contrast between the red of the lips has now become very dark. And here, the skin becomes very dark. Okay? So you can see how this gets changed dramatically by the use of channels. Okay? So, well, what we're talking about here then is this notion of here is another way that you can play around with how you wish to convert to black and white. And where you start with this, you might want to start with this, or you start with this, and then you can start masking, layering, doing all the other bits and pieces as well. Okay, so that's 3 different ways we've talked so far about the idea of converting to black and white. So there's just straightforward desaturation, there's the use of gradient maps, and then there's this notion of actually using the channels. And then a 4th way is, generally speaking, not just Photoshop, I think quite a lot of other editing programs have a black and white mixer. So if I click down here and I go to, there is actually a bit down here that says black and white. And what it does is it gives me a basic default, and it's split the colours here into 5 different channels. So I can lighten the reds individually of all the others. So it's not applying it, it's not like having the red fill. I can lighten the reds, darken the reds. I can take the yellows, lighten and darken. I can take the greens, lighten and darken. The aqua is more kind of in the background, and the blue is hitting that little purple bit here. Okay, so that's one. Now another version of this actually comes in if you have Camera Raw. So if I just duplicate that layer for a moment and I go to Filter Camera Raw in Photoshop, they have a black and white mixer as well. Up over here, sorry, just drag out from behind me. In the edit we've got auto and what have you. Just next to auto there's a bit that says B&W, and if I click B&W it's converted it to black and white, and it's given me a black and white mixer here, but it's a bigger range than the one that's sitting in the default Photoshop one. So here I've got instead of just red, I've got the red like we had before, and I've got the yellow, but I've also got an orange and a yellow and greens, aquas, blues, purples and magenta. Again, we will probably notice this more if we go to the kimono shot. So if I go to Filter Camera Raw here and go to black and white mixer, so the reds, you can see we can have an effect there. The oranges, slightly different effect. The yellows, different again. Okay, so whereas you only had the red or the yellow in the other mixer, that orange can make quite a bit of difference. Greens, not a lot of green in this, little bits. aqua, again, only little bits in this. Blue, lots more blue because of that blue gel on the off-camera flash over on the left. Purples, little bits of purple, and then magentas. Again, little bits in and out of the magenta as well. So if you want, you can play around that little bit more. I might decide to lighten the reds, but darken the oranges, boost the yellows, take down the greens. Actually, that's just looking awful. Maybe I wouldn't do that. Take down the reds, boost the oranges, or the yellows, take down the aqua or the blue. So you see, you could. So this here allows you to sort of much more customize the individual layers and bits and pieces you want to do, but it does apply it across the whole lot. So that then is your fourth option, whether you're using the Photoshop little menu bits or you're using the camera raw. There's that notion of selectively choosing the different bits of red, orange, yellow and colours, and using the sliders to lighten or darken different bits. So with all that in mind, if we go back to this notion then of photographing in black and white, if you just put your camera to default black and white and then click, it's made all these decisions for you. And you then end up with your JPEG file, which is already set, and you can't go in and make any further adjustments. So this is why I would recommend never shoot in black and white. Always shoot in colour, regardless of whether you've, if you've got the raw, if you're keeping the raw file anyway, and you just want to shoot in black and white just to see what it looks like, that's fine. But generally speaking, make sure you shoot in colour, especially raw, and then you've got so many extra options to make that conversion, which can have a profound effect on how the final image is going to turn out in black and white. So I hope that's all making sense. Let me know if anything isn't, or if you want me to explain anything a little bit deeper. So at this point then, well, just a quick little reminder that if you find these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining even, and you would like to support them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. Of course, don't forget the usual subscribe to YouTube, and if you want to stick images in for feedback, critique, if you've got ideas of what you would like these podcasts to cover, if you have questions, if you've got anything, discussions, anything photography related, any way that you would like to improve your understanding of photography, then you can either email me, kim@kimayres.co.uk, or you can join the Facebook and the Flickr groups, which are facebook or flickr.com/groups/UPwKA. Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Fairly straightforward. So, yes, that's where we are with that. So, now, okay. So, having the Bendu joins us and says, thank you for this. Ah, well, welcome, Bendu. Right, so the next bit we're going to move on to then is this notion of a high contrast, because not every photo actually works that well if you want to go high contrast. Now, so what is high contrast? Tell you what, let's try something else here, and just let's at its most basic, let's go into what we mean by the notion of high contrast. So if I flip back over here for the moment, and what we'll do is we'll just open a little thing here, and I will go to here and create a gradient tool. I've got it set black to white. I click here, I drag this over to here, and what we have is we have a gradient where it moves across the width of this picture in its entirety from white over here to black over here. And this gives us this full tonal range. And if I was to then take a little look at the levels over here, what we can see is it's spread pretty much evenly across the way. Okay, a little bit of peak over in the blacks, and in fact, actually, if I was to go back to the gradient map, let's just pull that in a fraction there, so we've definitely got white at the whites and black at the blacks. Go back to here, and what we can see then is it's peaking at both ends, and then relatively calm throughout the middle of it. Okay, so that's a kind of full tonal range. And generally speaking, when we go to black and white, a lot of what we want is that full tonal range. So when we're looking at things like that tulip, or we're looking at the kimono shot, then you want to have that kind of range. But what if we want to kind of restrict the range? What if we want to polarize it? So high contrast is that there's a stronger contrast, that we don't have this kind of range here. Now there's 2 or 3 different ways we can play with that as well. So what I might do is, if I go to brightness contrast here, then I can take the contrast tool, and if I do that, then it makes the blacks blacker, the whites whiter, and what we can see is it's restricting the tonal range. Within the brightness, if I make it brighter, it goes over here. If I make it darker, it shifts over to the left. Okay, and so the kind of quickest way of playing around with something like that to narrow the tonal range, but to make a stronger contrast between the lights and the darks, is to grab your brightness contrast and move the tool like that. So I'll tell you what, maybe too quickly did I close that one. So if I go back and reopen this, we do it. Let's do a quick desaturation, and then let's take the brightness contrast, and I can grab the contrast, and you can see that's what it's doing there. So by using the contrast, we are restricting the tonal range. Now let's come back here. That's one way of doing it. If we want to do more, the other 2 options tend to be playing around with either the curves or the levels. So if I take the curves tool, and what I do, if I can grab this and I move it this way, and I grab this and I move it this way, we can see we're really restricting the tonal range now is just to within this little bit of space between. And the more I move this over here, and the more I move this over here, till we get to this point whereby, apart from a tiny little bit of fuzz in the middle, we have reached maximum. It's just black and white. We've only got the 2 ends. So if we then go to our levels and see what that looks like, we can see little peak here, and nothing happening in between. Whereas if I go back to the curves here, and I stretch, take that back out again, a bit something like that, take a little look at the levels again, we now got a low bit here, and if we go back to, get this one, take the curves back like that again. And what we can also do is we can make bends with the curves and sort of create little, and we can decide where over here we want to create things. Okay, so there's little bits of flexibility with the curves. The other thing to do is, if I remove curves, is to play with the levels bit itself. With the levels, if I take this bit here and drag it over, we can see I can drag this up to the left and we're getting more and more lights. Or I can grab this to the right and the blacks come over. And the more I push these together, I can keep pushing until we end up again with this straight split black and white, which if I then created a second levels thing, so we can see it again, once again, we end up with it's all bunched up at either end with nothing happening in the middle. So our ultimate contrast is only black and only white. And then everything else in between kind of, so if I take then, let's go back to our tulip. Let's say, well, we'll play around with levels because it's as good as anything else. I can bring this up, make it brighter, bring this down, make it darker, bring it up, bring it down. And we might end up with something quite abstract, but to be honest, I don't think this really works as a photograph. We're playing around with graphic design, but you know, what really makes this photo, even in black and white, is the subtle gradations, is all these little tiny beautiful marks within the petals, okay, is the softness of the bouquet, of the out of focus tulip behind. So this would only work as a black and white photo because of the tonal range. Similarly, if we were to take that one of Lamnish in here, and we were to desaturate and then go to our levels and start playing around with this, we're losing the richness of it. And we zoom in here. Oh, yeah, okay. I mean, you can play around with it for graphic notions, but in terms of a reasonable photo, what makes this an interesting photo is the full tonal range that we've got to play with. So an important point to remember here then is that once we've converted to black and white, if we want to go high contrast, we have to pick our picture carefully. Not every picture is going to work. Very rarely do portraits work at a really high contrast, or anything which has a lot of subtle gradation, because subtlety gets lost. So what are we better off doing? We're better off starting with something which maybe doesn't have a lot of tonal range in the first place. What's Meg say? Meg says, that was very interesting with the tulip. Thank you, Meg. Okay, so let's, what should we do? Yeah, okay, let's take something like, sorry, open with Photoshop. Let's take this tree. So here's a picture of a tree taken in the snow. Now, it is a colour photo. If we zoom in closely, you can see here that there is a bit of green field where the snow hasn't quite hit. There's little bits of... so there is colour in here, but there's not a lot. Okay, and so we're already kind of halfway there. There is tree. We can see detail within the tree. We can see the lighter bits of where the twigs are and stuff, but we're kind of almost into sort of semi-silhouette territory. So actually, if we want to convert this, if I take this to a hue saturation and just desaturate, we're not really noticing huge amounts of difference because the colour wasn't very strong to begin with. And then if I take the levels, we can see there's a little bit of a gap here. I can bring that up a little bit. All I'm doing is making what's currently a kind of a grey sky. We can actually take that up to white. And then I can take the blacks down, make those blacks a little bit more. Now, it's then ending up slightly messy in the middle here. So what I might do, that I can then move this middle bit up and down to sort of decide where the mid-range is going to get caught between the black and white. So I can do something like this, and here now we have a high contrast black and white photo. There's not a lot of range within it. So again, if I click on extra levels here, what we see is we've got a peak over on the left, a peak over on the right, a little bit so playing around here, but there's not a lot happening in the middle. The histogram isn't all happening in the middle, it's all happening at the edges. Okay, so we come here and we can play around with these. So having converted it to black and white, we can play around with the levels to decide whereabouts we want to have that range and where the contrast lies. So one of your starting points then, quite often with high contrast, is to look for a photo that already has high contrast and is maybe a relatively simple design. And to a certain extent, things like this where you've got quite a lot of negative space tend to work quite well as well. Okay, another option here is, let's go to spiderweb. Okay, so this spiderweb, now it's a colourful photo. These were the genuine colours out of focus in the background. For the life of me, I can't remember what it was that was behind the spiderweb that created those colours. But we have the colours. Now, again, if I desaturate, we end up with these sort of greys, and then, but it's sort of slightly duller. And again, if I then go to the levels, what I can do is I can darken down and create more of a contrast between the lights and the darks. And then if I move the central bit down again, that gets rid of that slightly lighter patch that was sitting in the middle. And now we have essentially close to pure black and white. In fact, I can drag that a little bit more, but I don't want to make it absolute because I don't want it to get too pixelated at the edges. But if we move in here now, coming close, I can take that out a little bit, drag it up. I don't want to have that kind of bit in the background, so I'll just take that up, drag that down a little bit there, and there's a little bit of gradation between the black and the white, but not a lot. And so this then, because we've got this more geometric as well, patterns, lines and forms, where we're not having to worry about tonal gradation in between. This lends itself very well to this idea of high contrast. So large chunks of negative space, lines of a single tone, in this case lots of little dewdrops or raindrops on it as well. April says, I really like the dark brown background with the web. Yeah, absolutely. And in black and white, it is where it works really well. Okay, another option. Let's take this one. Okay, so again, partly what works with this is the fact that it is. Now we're going for minimalism here, really, with this shot. So we've got a couple of twigs. It's a foggy day, fog on the loch. We've got these twigs sitting in the calm water with reflections, or little bits of branch from a submerged bit of tree. Okay. Now, again, very little colour, so converting it to black and white makes almost no difference to the picture. That's fine. But now, if we take the levels, we can... Now, if we bring it right up, what happens is we've sort of lost what's going on there. If we bring it down, and what's happening here actually is that the water, the gradations of the water are sort of, when we look at this, it is fairly subtle, but it is a darker grey down here and a lighter grey up there. So if we're wanting to create more of a contrast, we might sort of bring it up like that and bring it down like that. We can shift the middle one about, and then that actually allows us more to kind of even out the midtones a little bit. Now that I've got that, let me just duplicate that layer a moment. One of the things I could do as well is actually use the dodge and burn. So if I go to the dodge tool, I've got it on midtones 27, doesn't really matter. But now, if I start rubbing this over here, it starts evening it out. It starts taking out just where it was too dark at the bottom. Okay, then what I can also do is I can go to the burn tool. I'll take the burn tool, I've got shadows, just for quickness, again, I'll shove that at about 27, and I can go into where the twigs have become a little bit too light. Okay, and now we've got this much more kind of high contrast. So again, if we go to the levels here, what we're seeing is get the levels one on top of that. Yes, it's now kind of bunched up very much with the whites because most of it's white, and then there's a little peak of the blacks in the background. Now I've left these top bits pale to get that kind of grey because that adds to that sense of they're in the distance, they're fainter. But overall, this sits as very much a kind of a high contrast image. If I wanted, I could, let's go back to here, I could darken down those bits as well, keep the contrast. But I think, to be honest with this picture, if we make those two black, I think it kind of ruins the feel of it. But this notion then of using a picture which, again, let's just group those so we can go back to the original photo. If you look at a photo like this, it's minimalism, but actually there's a lot of gradation. There's a lot of gradation through this water here. And what we've done is we've used the conversion process of black and white and then used the levels to get it started, and then we're using the dodge and burn to make it more so. Okay, so when you're thinking about a high contrast image, your starting image becomes really important. And very often this kind of minimalism, large amounts of negative space, is a good way to start. Another option here is to think geometric shapes. Geometric shapes very often work well as well. Let me just close a couple of these just so I'm not taking up too much space here. So if let's say I open this photo here. So what we've got here is we've got a stairwell. This one taken at Dumfries Royal Infirmary. And I happened to lean over, got my phone with me, take a photo, and it's got all these wonderful lines. The thing is as a colour photo, it's not really working so well. It's just got a sort of slight yellow tinge to it. What's really interesting about this photo is the notion of these geometric lines. It's the black lines of the railings and the black lines that are on the edges of each of the steps. So if we then go to, okay, we'll just desaturate. But now everything's become slightly greyish. So again, we can go to levels. We can drag up the whites, we can drag down the blacks. We can use this middle bit here to make it more contrasty. Make that bit lighter, make that bit darker. And we really want to try and get the blacks black, I think. Get more of the whites in. And we're trying to sort of whiten up the steps a bit, I think, here. Now, again, if we go completely white, I think we've maybe gone too far. But I think what we want to do is we definitely want to have them looking lighter. And again, what I could do, if I wanted, is go over to my dodge tool and just run it over part of that and something like that. I might have gone slightly too far with that. But anyway, what you do here, what you see here is the effect that we've gone from that to this. And this then works really well as a high contrast. Tonal range isn't needed in something like this. What is making this photo is the geometry, the geometric shapes, it's the lines, it's the verticals, it's that little bit of diagonal, it's the sense of the white straight lines against, sorry, the black lines against the white background is what makes this photo work. And that sense of it being a kind of a square spiral as such as you go down through the layers. So what we're trying to do by creating a high contrast image is play to the strengths of the image. So yes, like I said, subtle gradations, very complex images don't tend to work quite so well, whereas things like geometric shapes really do. Another option here is one that I again taken at the DGRI, it just seemed to work rather well, was I took this shot of the corridor. And so I'm just looking straight down the corridor. There's hardly anything. We've managed to get it virtually empty. Again, using my phone. A couple of people right at the end. Now there is colour in this shot. We've got a green line running across along here. There's coloured bits coming through the window. A little pink patch on the floor. A little kind of greenish patch on the floor. There's little bits of colour. But actually, if we come to this and we start thinking, well, would this work as an interesting one? Well, as April said, I can picture Anne's work with black and white contrast with her abstracts. Anne? Not sure which Anne you mean, April. Meg says, I like the diagonals of the stairs. So if we take something like this then, and again, we can go to hue saturation, desaturate, and go to our levels. And as we can see at the moment, it's in the histogram, it's very well spread across, but we boost this up, we drag this down, and April says Robert's Anne. All right, okay, yes. Yes, a lot of Anne's, yes, I know what you mean, because Anne very much tends to, she's done quite a lot of, she will zoom in on particular shapes and forms, and yes, a lot of these would work with high contrast black and white. So you can see then that actually going black and white here and increasing the contrast. Now we can decide to make it a lighter corridor or we can make it a darker corridor, but somewhere along the line we need to kind of find our balance. So this tends to be, now what I do like the shadows. I like making this lighter, but I don't want to lose too much of the shadows. So what I could do with this again is go back into here and take the burn tool and then run it over the shadows. So where there are shadows, I'm just going to make those shadows darker, something like that. What I might want to do is actually lighten up this wall on the left, so I'll go to the dodge tool and lighten that up. Maybe even lighten that ceiling a touch. Okay, no, maybe that was too far. Right, okay, so I'll just go back and maybe lighten this wall, maybe do a second run over that, something like that. And what we can see here then is we've now got this really interesting contrast in the black and white. I think I've gone too far on that bit, but never mind. The point is that this then becomes a high contrast image. And what we're doing is we're using the geometrical shapes, all these squares, all these lines that have been work even in colour for the idea of drawing your eye down the corridor. But when we put it into black and white and then we boost that contrast, absolutely ramp up that notion of the contrast and that depth and that layers. So the geometrical shape side of things tends to be a really good one to think about. When you're going back to this notion of high contrast, if you get an image which has already got contrast in it, that helps. If you've got place with negative space, minimalism, that works. And if you've got these notion of strong geometrical shapes and lines with contrast, that tends to work really well as well. Ovigi says, classic capture. Yeah. Another thing you can do then is play around with the different versions of how you convert. So if we take something like this old classic Bentley, right, and if I just straightforwardly or desaturate and then take the levels, then it sort of can work a bit, but it's kind of a bit difficult. We've got very much this sort of blue-grey area here, which is it's getting a bit too busy. But so if instead of hue saturation, what I do is I go to the black and white channel and I take the aqua, you see, so that blue bit in the paler blue, drag that up, make that lighter, make that whiter. That's greens in the background. I'll take those greens down as well, so those trees become a little bit more. And then I can go to my levels. Let's grab a fresh levels thing here and start creating a contrast. And actually, it tends to work better. I think now we've got that pale patch in the middle, I think it's sort of working better now. I think we've maybe got a problem with overkill on the, well, because the tarmac, I think, is too textured. That becomes a case of what we might want to do is actually, if we make it too light, we lose out on the edge. So again, what I might do is just aim for looking at what the car looks quite good, and then I'll duplicate that, and then let's lighten up the tarmac using the I could go the other way actually and darken it down if I wanted, but because of the shadows and the bottom part of the car, what we're wanting is the contrast there to make it stand out. So by using the dodge and burn tool to lighten up the ground around it, it enables this car to stand out much more. So now it's looking more like a kind of pen and ink drawing as such, but there is something quite nice, I think, that works quite well with this car then sitting in that slightly more high contrast element. So it's not just a case of take your image, desaturate, play with the levels. You can also use that notion of your black and white sliders to make parts of the image lighter or darker before you start. I'm going to use another example here. Okay, what April says, so it seems the less colour a picture has, the easier it is to convert to high contrast. Well, it's not necessarily the less colour it has, it's more about the contrast in the colours and how you can remove or shift. This next bit is, I think, will probably demonstrate what I mean, April. So what I want to do now is let's open this photo here. So here we have a lot of colour. Okay, so we've got cherry blossom, bright pink cherry blossom against a blue sky. So as a colour photo, this is a great colour photo. Okay, we've got this fantastic contrast between the pinks and the blues. And it's all about the colour. can you do a decent black and white, and can you do a high contrast black and white? Now look what happens if I go to the hue saturation and I desaturate. Ooh, yeah, we've kind of lost it, because in the end the tonal range of the pinks isn't massively different to the tonal range of the blues. And so what's happened is everything's kind of become pushed into the middle and it's relatively dull. Now, where this will work best is actually if I go to the channels. Remember our channels, because if I go to a red channel, we notice here that the blue sky becomes quite dark and the cherry blossom becomes really quite light. If I go to the green channel, then everything's kind of back more into mid-range. And if I go to the blue channel, now the blue channel, so what happened is the blues have become very, very light. Okay, so the difference between the red channel and the blue channel is really significant. So what I could do is I could do two entirely different versions of this. So if I hold on, cancel that. That wasn't what I meant to do. So I'll select all. I will copy the blue channel, come back into here and paste this, right? And then what I can do, I'll maybe get my levels here. I'll bring up the mid-tones a little bit, bring up the whites a little bit, just make that sky a little bit whiter. Now I can drag that down and make that harsher, but I won't. Well, what I think I will do is more selectively do that. I'm going to take the burn tool, and then I'm going to apply it to sort of certain little areas here. And what we're doing here is we're creating this contrast then. So let me go back to the levels. Actually, I will move that bit up, move the middle bit up a little bit more here, and then burn in into some of these little bits of shape here. And this then is giving us, we've essentially created this cherry blossom against a white background, and it becomes quite interesting to do it like that. Now, another option is if we go back to our channels layer, and I take the red option. So now I will copy that, not that, sorry, back into here and paste that in. And actually, I'll tell you what, first of all, let's just group those. And now what I can do is with this, I can do the same thing again. I can take the levels, only I will drag down the darks. Okay, so we're basically making the black background much blacker. But I also don't want to make it too dark with the cherry blossom. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the burn tool in the background, which is going to just make those blues darker. Now, I've run that over a couple of times. Now we've got little bits of cloud which are coming in here, so at that point maybe I just use the remove tool, one of the something like that. And now what we've got is we've got these colours sitting against the whites, and maybe if I bring that up, I'll take that down a little bit, create a little bit more contrast. Again, if I want, I can just put it, oh, that wasn't what I meant to do. Go back to the burn tool to create a little bit more texture within the picture. So our options then are, so let's go back to this, lighten those. Out of the same picture, we can have a very high contrast, a kind of high key high contrast, and we can have much more of a sort of slightly lower key, but the white, so the cherry blossom can be white against black, or it can be kind of more kind of greys against white. So the very same picture, which is taking us back to our original here, is able to give us two very distinctly different kinds of high contrast images. Okay, so that's really how I want you to start thinking about this. I want you to start thinking that it's starting with the different ways then, the different ways you can get your high contrast image is you've got your different conversion to black and white techniques, whether you're just using a desaturate and then you play around with your levels, or you're using your gradient map, but again you can still play around with levels or curves within that, or you're using your black and white mixer, or you're using your channels. And then within that you can start dodging and burning. You can even mix, where you take one kind of channel, overlay it with another, and then mask out. So there's multiple options and ways you can play with to create that high contrast. But generally speaking, what you are looking for is your starting photo either needs to have sort of plenty of negative space, have or a minimalism kind of feel, or strong geometrical lines, or some kind of existing strong contrast. So the cherry blossom one there doesn't even have strong geometrical lines, but there is a lot of contrast between the pinks and the blues, and there is quite a lot of that blue space which isn't really doing much, which is kind of acting in a negative space kind of way. So that's really giving you lots of options to play with. And again, if you really want to have a little bit of fun, some of you may have noticed the cover card that I had on for this episode, and that started off with this photo here. So I've done a shoot with Sam and Joe, and so for this I'm going to close this in a little bit tighter just so we can get this. Now this photo was deliberately taken as a very low contrast semi-silhouette kind of thing. It was a hazy late afternoon, and the two of them just kissing on the edge of the shore. Now generally speaking, what will happen here is, I'm just going to duplicate that layer for a moment. I can convert this, let's do just a desaturate, and then if I take my levels side of it, I can make the lights lighter, and I can turn it into a silhouette. Okay, and that's kind of fun, that's okay, that's quite nice as a silhouette. But there is something, and I can move that about there. So that then is a nice kind of high contrast natural image. But one of the things that I want to talk about here is what I quite liked was Samantha's dress here. I like these little flower patterns on here, but because it's a slightly fuzzy image, there's not a huge amount of we can see the contrast, but our brain is filling in much more than there actually is. But I wanted to kind of see if I could bring out the whites in there to put into the high contrast image. So actually the best thing to do with this is, what I can do is I'm going to go around and just select essentially her dress, and I'm going to copy that, I'm going to place it on a separate layer, and then I'm going to go into Camera Raw, and I'm going to see if I can create more contrast out of this. Now, so if I go to the light, I can hit contrast, but that's just kind of made everything duller. So maybe I want to bring shadows up. That's not work. Do that. Another option here, let's use the dehaze. Dehaze is helping. That's kind of bringing out something here. Increase the texture, increase the clarity. Now, I might need to take that exposure up a little bit more. It's now getting very, very fuzzy, so I will just go into the details and do a little bit of noise reduction with that. But you can see here now that I'm getting more and more contrast, and that's kind of what I'm wanting to do. I'm wanting to get more with the lights now. So let's say we go to that. Now let's go back to putting it in black and white, and we can now see we've got all these little shapes of the flowers coming out. And if I go over to my dodge tool, I can just start bringing out a few more of these where they've just not kind of become hidden. And so there's something kind of fun, I think, about the idea that now over here what's happened is it started bringing up a little bit too much. So I will take the burn tool and just run the burn tool back over this and just get rid of those little bits where the dots are kind of becoming a little bit too much. Because what I want is, I'm wanting more kind of blocks of colour. These little bits down here on the shore, I can maybe, in fact actually if I wanted to get those black and white, I could even just take a black paintbrush and paint over some of those bits here. I could then also, if I wanted, take the dodge tool, brighten up the mud flats a little bit, something like that. And now we end up with something which is the fun for me with this is that it's silhouette plus, because her dress is now we've just got the white patches of the flowers on her dress standing out against the silhouette within it. And I think that's kind of fun. So it's that notion of high contrast. Doesn't have to be absolute black and white, but it also look for places where you can play around with getting contrast within the contrast as well. So I hope that all makes sense. What have we got? Oh, April said, yes, I like that look. And this is the part where I was a bit getting mixed up. High key, low key. Okay, that's to do with when we were looking at the Blossom pictures. Yeah, high key, generally speaking, is high key shot tends to be, generally speaking, it's mostly highlights. I think highlights. Low key tends to generally be is dominated by the blacks and the darks. So to kind of bring all this together then, to sum up, in order to get a good high contrast black and white photo, first of all, we need to take our colour photo and convert it to black and white. And because there's so many different ways we can convert to black and white, we don't want to do it automatically in the camera. So don't have your camera set to black and white when you take the photo, have your camera set to colour, then put it into your editing software and you have multiple options for converting to black and white. Now that might be as simple as desaturate, or it might be using a gradient map, which gives you a kind of more punch, generally speaking, to begin with. Or you might want to use the channels, which really change the different emphasis of which colours are likely to be light and which colours are likely to translate as dark when you do that conversion. Or you might want to use a black and white mixer, which allows you to individually shift the reds or the yellows or the blues or the magentas and what have you. Once you have your picture converted to black and white, you're looking for a way to convert it in such a way that is helping you with how it's going to look afterwards when you contrast it. And then your contrast, generally speaking, your levels tool will do most of the job for you. Alternatively, you can use your curves, which allows you to get into certain subtle areas. And sometimes you could even just straightforwardly using the brightness contrast slider can get you to where you want relatively quickly. But then don't forget, you can also take different ways of converting to black and white and say, well, actually, I quite like the way this part of the picture gets converted here in this way, and I like the way it gets converted this way using this one, and then overlay them, use masks, shift things down. And so the amount of editing you want to do, obviously it depends on you, how much you enjoy editing, how much you like the challenge of it, as opposed to how much you just want to run away from it. The quick thing is desaturate, play with your levels. And actually quite often that's a good way to start anyway, because it would at least to give you that kind of thumbnail sketch, that sense of a starting point. Does this photo look like it might work as a high contrast image? So high contrast then, that notion that we're actually removing the broad tonal range. Some photos can handle that really well, and generally speaking those tend to be ones that are already slightly high contrast, which might be silhouettes or have a lot of a lot of negative space, minimalism, or quite very often strong geometric shapes, straight lines, repetitive patterns. These kind of things tend to work well as high contrast images. So now you've been through all this, I'm setting the challenge. Okay, so in 2 weeks' time, we are having the high contrast black and white challenge. So if you need to go back, rewatch this, rewatch it at high speed, flick through to the bits that you might need to watch twice, you can. You've now got all this information sitting here. Either you might want to go out and take a photo specifically. There might be somewhere close by where you can think, oh, actually, I can think of exactly the kind of space or the place which might make a high contrast image. Go and get a photo, play with it. Or you might want to raid your archives, go through your folders of images, find something that you think is going to work. And then send me your images for 2 weeks' time. So it's the 14th of September today. 2 weeks' time will be the 28th of September. Try and get your images to me before Friday the 26th, because I still have to have time to put it together. And in fact, actually, the earlier the better, because on the 27th I've got an all-day photo shoot. And I'm not going to feel like putting together the podcast when I get back from that, that's for sure. So yeah, Friday the 26th at the absolute latest, but earlier if you can. Next week, there will be no podcast. Next week on the 21st, it happens to be Maggie and my wedding anniversary. We've been together, we got married 30 years ago. So it's our 30th wedding anniversary. While we would love to go trotting off somewhere around the world to go and celebrate for a week, the reality is we get one night away. So we're away for the night and away on Saturday night, Sunday morning. So I won't be around here for the podcast on the 21st. So now you've got all your information, everything you need to know about how to make a high contrast black and white photo, and the challenge then for 2 weeks' time. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you can come up with for that. So anybody who puts an image in for the challenge will get an automatic 10 smug points, and of course I will have my favourite 30, 20 and 10. And what we introduced at the last challenge as well was the idea of the popular vote as well. So there's the chance for getting a bonus 20 smug points if you happen to get the popular vote of everybody who's watching. So plenty to play for. Right, okay. Marilyn says congrats on your anniversary, and so does Fiji. Thank you. Right, I think that pretty much brings us to the conclusion. John says happy anniversary too. Thank you. Right, so that brings us to the end of the podcast. Thank you ever so much for everybody for turning up and leaving comments. And I really look forward to seeing what you're going to put in for the challenge for 2 weeks' time. Enjoy your fortnight. I will see you then. Take care. Bye-bye.